Oh, hello, hello. Welcome to the Have No Sphere Friday French Cast. That's right. It is Friday. We made it. TGIF. That's flat. That's Frank. I don't know. We're here. You made it. That's what matters. We have a great show planned. Oh, my goodness. The guest we have in line today. We've been waiting. We've been hoping. We've been trying to make this work. And finally, the planets have aligned. That's right. I said planet. Hello, everybody. Walt here. Hope you had a great week. It's Friday. We're going to chill. We're going to relax. We're going to get to know our guest here in a few minutes. Let me introduce the fellows. You know them. You love them. We have Zach, too nice for Rice Zabala. That's right. The nomad himself. Zach, how are you this week, sir?
Oh, I'm doing wonderful, Walt. It's been a good week. Weather's finally starting to cool off down here a little bit. Just the high 70s now, so I'm loving life. Hank and his new friend, Buddy, are thick as thieves. They've been running around here chasing lizards, and they've got the campsite on lockdown to where not a lizard is allowed to move around the
Get
place.
those lizards. That's what I'm all about.
It's just been so much fun sitting there just watching those two. It's been a good week though. Weather's been great, and traveling's going well.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. We also have with us, as always, that Adam, the man behind the secret weapon, the secret sauce, the sound production. How are you, Adam? How is it, my friend?
Can you hear me?
Ah, the secret sauce. It worked. Yes.
I'm just checking. I didn't know what was going off there. Yeah, fantastic, mate. Looking forward to this evening. We've been chatting with the guest.
The guest. Secrets.
Yeah, I'm excited already because I think I alluded. He's a man of a very different background to us, but of a very similar mind, I think. So I'm looking forward to having not necessarily a debate, but a good old chat. So yeah, I had a lovely week as well. Been busy because I know we've got something else planned for after Mark leaves. Been busy trying to put a few slides together for some of the work that's
awesome. That's awesome. I know exactly what you mean on that one.
Yeah. So hopefully at the end of this, we'll have a little bit of just an update with what is quite a current topic, particularly in the flat Earth at the moment.
Absolutely, I've seen video after video pop up about this. So Zach, you definitely have started a revolution. Let me move on to our buddy across the pond there. Savage. I don't have the sound bite. I can't play it for you, John. How are you, friend?
Yeah, not too bad at all. Not too bad at all. Had a very good week. Really looking forward to tonight and chatting with Mark. I'm so bad with names that, as you guys know, and my memory is appalling, legendarily appalling. That I was listening to Crow 777 this week, number 130, his podcast, and they were talking about the music industry and a book by a guy called McGowan, who I'm sure our guest can fill us in on, but I'm going to let it drop on because I've already put a tweet out anyway. But they mentioned this guy Mark Devlin, who had taken over the mantle from McGowan, and I was walking around the fields going, Mark Devlin, where do I know that bloody name from? And then it just clicked. Oh bloody hell, we've got him coming on Friday. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. And someone better introduce him pretty quick, smart.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Instead of us all rambling on and on about our amazing guest, how about we just introduce and meet him and get to know him? Everyone, instead of me rambling and filling you in, let's just introduce the man. Hello, Mark Devlin. We are so glad to have you here on the IRM French Cast here on Have No Sphere. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you. And what a build-up. No pressure, eh, after that mystery guest. Glad to be on with you. And I've got to say, I love the fact that today's date is 9/11. When you express it in the UK way, anyway, the proper way of expressing
the right way, exactly.
9/11, yeah. It seems whenever I do one of these shows, the date is kind of scheduled randomly and arbitrarily, and it always ends up having some sort of occult significance to it. So
Does that
did a show with
bode well
Billy
or
Ray
not?
Valentine the other day on Halloween, and here we are a few days later on 9/11. So no shortage of discussion points today, right?
I'll tell you what, correcting these Americans has become a bit of a tradition for the Brits on this side. We've had John.
It's aluminium, not aluminum.
They've even done that on TFR. They did stand corrected. I heard that the other day.
We've
had John Get Jeranism admit that it is maths, not math.
Yeah.
And I've got one, if we can get on board. I was trying to get Zach to. These Americans have these things that float in water called buoys, don't they?
Yeah, it's a buoy.
It's a buoy, isn't it? And is it density and buoyancy?
I've been using that.
Yeah, good man. So that's our next conversion that we've got coming up, Mark.
We're going to break this whole vocabulary down.
And also, it's Adolf Hitler, not Adolf Hitler, just for reference.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Adam, I think that's a good segue into the first question about. Do many people know that you have considered and looked into the flat Earth phenomena?
It's not something I tend to shout from the rooftops about. I've never done a specific show about it, but I've dropped many little hints and many little sound bites into radio shows that I've done and public presentations. So anyone paying attention with their ear to the ground would be able to determine where I stand on this whole thing, because there's no shortage of, little clues and pointers. So I kind of started making these little public expressions a couple of years ago, I guess, because it took me until that point to become convinced of where I stood on the whole thing. I floundered for quite a while and sat on the fence for a good couple of years, as I'm sure most people do. And then I reached the point where really it had become undeniable to me. And it was pretty bloody obvious that we've been completely lied to systematically about the true cosmology of the place that we live. And I consider myself to be an open-minded, critically thinking truth seeker. That's what we're all supposed to be. And so if that's what you are, you go where the information takes you, no matter what. Sometimes it's unsettling, sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it means admitting to a lifetime of mind control. But it's not the first time I've had to admit to that. I expose all these music acts and all these different scenes and genres, which previously I used to lap up and really enjoy. And now here I am telling everyone that these artists are not who you thought they were, and that the music industry is being used for mind control and social engineering. It's very uncomfortable territory, but I'd already had a grounding in being prepared to go to some of these uncomfortable places. So it set me in good stead for where I stood on the nature of the place that we live.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't know you were so far down the rabbit hole and actually brave enough to make that sort of conclusion one way or the other. It's but it
I'm there.
It doesn't surprise me.
I heard you give Billy Ray a prod actually, and he ignored it on that.
Yeah, exactly. I do drop these little hints and pointers, and sometimes people pick up on them, and sometimes they ignore them. I think Billy Ray's sympathetic to it, actually, from conversations I've had with him. But
he's a closet flat earther, mate. He's a closet one.
Right, yeah, I know a few of those. But obviously I've copped a lot of flack, and certain people have actually shut themselves off from the entirety of my work, the whole body of my work, just because of my stance on this one issue.
Well,
which is incredibly small-minded, but there are people that will do that. They're prepared to throw out everything else that you have to say on the basis of disagreeing with you on this one fundamental point. If you want to have a Facebook argument that will last for weeks and weeks and weeks, mention Paul McCartney, Donald Trump, or Flat Earth. Any of those will do it.
Well, you've already got rid of my question number one, which was, is it 9/11? And now you're on to question two, Paul McCartney, which is Walt's.
Oh, we're segueing nicely here.
Absolutely. Like it was built that way.
Yeah.
So what was your question,
actually,
Adam?
You know what? There's a lot of 9/11 synchronicity when it comes to the Beatles. I think it's today, actually, that the 50th anniversary edition of the Beatles' White Album is being released. I'm pretty sure that was released on the 9th of November 1968, and certainly there's a new version of it coming out. I think that is today, and there's all kinds of references in Beatles history to the date 9th of November, like TV interviews that the group did, songs that were recorded on this particular date. It certainly weaves itself into the whole Beatles story, that particular date. And there's the connection there with Aleister Crowley and all this number magic that he was involved with. And the Beatles were one of many acts that expressed a reverence for the occult teachings of Aleister Crowley. So the whole thing goes very deep and it's interconnected at every level.
I wanted to talk to you about David Bowie a bit later and his last album, Black Star, what you made of it. But since you brought up Crowley anyway, you might as well... Have you done any research into what on earth that whole album and was about?
Well, yeah, I did at the time, and it seems to be a closing chapter to Bowie's career. And many researchers commented that it appeared to show someone that was aware of his imminent demise and was preparing for it and encoding it into his art. This, of course, fuels rumours that Bowie's death was in some way a hoax and that he didn't actually die but just went off to live out his remaining years outside of the public spotlight. We get this whenever a high-profile artist is reported to have died, of course. You know, people say that about Prince, about Michael Jackson, about Tupac, about Elvis. To be honest, it's impossible to know. I would say you can only go with your best guess based on the evidence that's available to you. And I always say that I don't think you can make a blanket statement and say that all these artists fake their own deaths. It's quite possible that some do, but it's pretty clear to me that some of these deaths are genuine. When it comes to Bowie, I don't know. I really couldn't say. He was a master asset of the industry for many decades, of course. He pushed many different agendas, not least the promotion of androgyny and the blurring of the genders, you know, with that wearing makeup and all his garb and stuff in the 1970s.
Yeah.
With that in mind, right, guys, with that, rather than going into specific individual celebrities, do you think, Mark, that maybe there's, in regards to the whole mind control system, that these celebrity identities, their lives, their highs, their lows, is all part of the control system of engaging, whether it's just distraction, but also maybe sometimes emotional control of large population, all sorts of things. Do you think outside of this, that actually this whole thing is just another part of the stage, put simply?
You're asking if artists kind of use these personas for the purposes of mind control and it's not really them, but it's an act that they're...
I wonder whether the artists are even real. You're in a better position. To me, you know, I look at the current artists, as you call them, of today, and, you know, it all seems more manufactured than it was when I'm 45. I think you're not of a similar age. Well, when we were kids, there appeared to be an earning to some of it. I think if we looked at the Beatles, necessarily even going back, we could question how well earned fame is. And with that in mind, are the rises to fame just part of the system, just like the politics is, the pretense that there's debate, the pretense of this pretense of fame, and how much controlled is all of it? Do you know what I mean? Is it? I'll stop rambling. I hope you get the point.
So many of these musicians are actors. They're playing a role. You know, famously, we can look at Jim Morrison. He comes up in pretty much every conversation. This ties back into the work of Dave McGowan, where he revealed in his great book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, that Jim Morrison's father was the naval admiral in charge of the fleet of ships at the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which pretty much started the Vietnam War. So you've got this iconic larger-than-life rock god in Jim Morrison, who appears to be anti-establishment and anti-war, and his father's out there stirring up unrest in Southeast Asia, resulting in millions of people dying in the Vietnam War. And Jim Morrison was an actor. He took part in a promotional video for the University of Florida in 1964, way before he got reinvented as a rock star. Then you got the likes of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who and groups like this, and they're quite clearly all actors playing roles. An associate of mine said that one time they were sat on a flight next to Mick Jagger. They just happened to find themselves next to Mick Jagger, and they got into conversation with him, and he'd had a few drinks, so he became a bit loose-tongued. And he told this person that his job all along, all these decades, had been to keep the masses in base consciousness and, you know, rooted in their lower chakras and connected to sort of carnal desires, basically sex and drugs and rock and roll, and very much pandering to that base aspect of their nature rather than exploring any kind of spirituality or consciousness. So you know, he's supposed to have actually come out and stated that as having been his job all along. And I think there's different grades to these musicians. When you look at somebody like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or David Bowie, they're very high up the pecking order, I would suggest, and they're very key assets. They're used to push many of these agendas. And I think in many cases, they're very much aware of what they're actually doing. But then you've got all these pop puppets that we have in the contemporary era, which you just alluded to there. You can think of all the Miley Cyruses and Taylor Swifts and Katy Perrys and, you know, Poppy, this artist that I mentioned earlier. And I think many of these are just manipulated marionettes, you know, and they just do what they're told to do. And they've got handlers, and the handlers are the ones that call the real shots and understand what's really going on. So they're nowhere near of the level of some of these previous musicians who were, you know, sort of dark magicians and social engineers in their own right.
If I was going to say that, are you saying that basically the system now has full control and there's no access to individual talent that is able to speak out? Like, I don't know, Walt's probably better to speak on this with regards to the Beatles, but you see the assassination of some of them, the change of Paul McCartney. For me, it's alluded to some of the liberal speaking that they were making, some of the thoughts that they were generating in people. Is part of this mechanization of the music industry an attempt of controlling, again, the mainstream narrative? Do you think that's...
Well, I think it always has been. And the industry's always been in control. But I think they used to seek out musicians that had a bit of talent and had some personality and some sparkle and some charisma, which is how many of these early groups got so readily adopted into the public mindset. But I think in recent years, they've given up on that. And now they just have these puppets that perform to order. And that's why the music is also friggin' bland now and vacuous. I mean, when was the last time, being honest about it, you heard a new song on the radio that made you sit up and go, God damn, that's good. That is special. That's breaking boundaries. That's some real creative stuff right there. That's incredible. I can't remember the last time I had that reaction to anything on the radio. And yet that was my reaction to many of the songs from the 60s, 70s, and to a lesser extent the 80s. I think they've given up on seeking genuine creativity. And the so-called artists we've got today are there simply to push agendas and to sow attitudes and mindsets and reactions in the minds of the general public. That's their job.
I've got one point, and this is my only music question I have, really. And it's not so much born out of the music knowledge, it's born out of watching life change around me. And that was, I was a kid off the estate in the 70s and 80s in Nottingham. And so there was a small amount of black culture that came in. And I think probably like most kids who were 10 in the early 80s, got into a little bit of the Beastie Boys, Run DMC, etc., etc. And at that point it was new, it was interesting. But it wasn't pervasive to society. And what I saw over the 80s, I got into a bit of MC Hammer, and everything was good lyric-wise. But
Vanilla
what
Ice.
I saw, there is if you listen out there, mate, there is actually a Vanilla Ice version of me singing some Flat Earth raps. I won't. It's available somewhere if you go back through the archives. But for me, what's interesting is the way that music has changes culture. and how the promotion of very aggressive hip hop culture that changed from positive messages born out of street culture to very aggressive criminal kind of lyrics, which you saw in hip hop. And what you're seeing now with young girls and boys is music which is sexualizing them, and how that kind of is, to me, again, shifting and creating the paradigm of how they want society to be. And that's a big statement rather than a question. Sorry, Mark.
No worries. Well, that's certainly happened with hip hop, and I've spoken on many occasions about the instigation of this genre that was known as gangster rap that came in sort of towards the end of the 1980s. And I've mentioned that many years ago, before I woke up in inverted commas and I was still a DJ out there playing all this stuff, I would have defended all that. And I would have said there's no way that music can actually affect people's behaviors. That's just ridiculous to suggest. But I was coming from a place of ignorance then, because I'd done zero research into it. And this is always the problem. People spout opinions all over the bloody place without having done an ounce of research of their own. And when you've actually taken the time and trouble to do the research, you realize how ridiculous some of these statements were that you yourself may have made. So I've come to understand that absolutely music can change people's behaviors and attitudes, particularly young people, because it's always impressionable young people who are so much easier to shape and mold, that are in the crosshairs of these people that roll out these agendas. So with hip hop, they introduced all these aggressive lyrics, glorifying criminal lifestyles, and it had the desired effect, which was to coerce large numbers of young people, predominantly young black males, into emulating the lifestyles that were being portrayed by their favorite rap artists on these tracks. And it's been admitted to from certain factions in the industry that that was the aim, because the record industry at the time was working in cahoots with the private prison industry in America, and they were sharing their profits. So it was in the interests of those who controlled the record labels to put out music that ensured lots of young black males were getting locked up in the private prison industry, so that everyone concerned could make an absolute killing from the money that was to be made from all the cells being full, So that absolutely was a thing.
Mark, can you just touch on, sorry to interrupt, you've got to be quick around here. Can you just touch on the John Todd Collins interview and what that was about?
Sure. There was this guy that went by the name of John Todd, but he was also known as Lance Collins, and he appears to have been a part of this long-running generational bloodline of occultists and witches, the Collins family. And he was put to use in the American record industry in the 1970s. He worked for a company called Zodiac Productions, and that had affiliations with many of the major record labels in the 1970s. And in a famous monologue that he gave, which you can get on YouTube, you can listen to him talking about this in his own words. He mentioned that Zodiac Productions was connected to Lloyd's of London and JP Morgan Bank and Standard Oil. Those are the sort of companies that were bankrolling it. They're all in it together. And he said that his job was to manage all these different record acts. And he spoke about this standard ritual which used to take place in the record industry, whereby all the major labels of the time would have what they referred to as a temple room in their corporate HQ. And he said they would bring in the master tape of a new album that they wanted to put out in the days of analog tape, and they would wheel in a coven of witches. This is what he says in his own words. And these witches would stand around the master tape, which they would place on an altar, and they would imbue it with a spell or a hex. And the idea is that some of the signature energy of the spell, that dark negative energy, would attach itself to the tape on an energetic level, because everything in creation is made up of sound and light frequency, basically on an unseen level when you get beyond the physical. And, the energetic signature of an implied will or intent can indeed attach itself to, an item in that way. So the idea was that every time a copy was made of that tape and an album went out into the general public, it would carry some of that sort of spell or hex that had been cast on it. So, like I say, this is this guy saying that this is what went on.
And it goes further than that.
There have been many other examples of this. Yeah.
The guy chopping up chopping up little slivers of master recording or whatever it was and putting it into the actual album covers. Is that right? Who was that?
This is Dave Grohl. This is Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters.
Ah, that's right.
So a few years ago, that group put out an album, and they hit upon the brilliant marketing gimmick of mastering it on analog tape, because these days it's all done by a computer. But Dave Grohl said he wanted to go back to basics, master it on a reel-to-reel tape machine in his garage. And then they hit upon the idea of chopping up the tape once the album had been mastered and putting a tiny little shard of tape into each of the jewel cases of the CD copies of this album that would go out there. And on the surface of it, you might think, oh, that's a neat little trick, that's just a cute little gimmick. But if there's any truth to what John Todd spoke about in terms of bad energy being able to attach itself to master recordings, then is it possible that there could have been an ulterior motive at play here in terms of getting this stuff out into people's homes?
And just on that note, I mean, it always sort of struck me as weird. When I was a kid, you had to buy the album and you had to do this and the other, and then they brought out tape to tapes, and then the internet came along, and now you can literally stream films that are in the cinema at the moment. Apologies, it's pissing down with rain here. Don't know if that...
It is here too.
Yeah. And
bloody England.
Yeah,
Snap.
We love it, don't we? But that was my question. Do you think that's the reason why we have films and music so readily available and free now? All right, they tell you copyright, yada yada, but anyone can get hold of any bit of music they want for absolutely free. And it would make sense that if there was something embedded in that music that was a message or a feeling that they wanted to get out there, then that's the perfect way to do it.
Well, that's right. Everything is readily available now. And it used to be the case that to be a DJ, you had to have access to record company mailing lists and to know which import shops to go to. And you'd spend all day hunting through these obscure records that had just come in from America, because that was the only way to stay on top of your game and have tunes that nobody else did. But of course, that's all gone now, because any kid in his bedroom can download any track that's ever been recorded if they know where to look. And the whole of culture has just been weaponized. And I was going to make a really profound point there, and I've forgotten what it was.
Well, let me wait for you then, because I liken it to their No, I've gone completely way off.
You see, we all know that feeling.
I was going to talk about the Beatles and Fall and ego deaths and everything, but no, and relate it even back to Flat Earth, but it's cocked up on me as well. He's found it, Adam.
Oh, come on, go on, Mark.
No, I'm still trying to remember the point. Just recap on the question, and I'll remember the point. What was the question?
We'll have all forgotten that now.
Shit, now you've done it. The question was, is that why it's free? Is that because there's something embedded in the music and the films that they inherently want us to adopt?
Right, okay. I've remembered my profound point, which was, so everything now is done electronically and digitally. Music is delivered in digital fashion. And it's interesting to me that you have this process of creating MP3s, which is where you take a master file like a WAV, where you've got the full frequency range, all the information is there in the file, and you can stick it into something like iTunes and create an MP3. And what that process actually does is strip away a whole load of information which is deemed indiscernible to the human ear. So when you hear the MP3, to your mind, it sounds exactly the same as the original track, but there's a whole load of data that's been stripped out, but you don't notice. So if there's data being stripped out of a recording that you don't notice, it follows that there could also be stuff being stripped in that you don't notice either. And, I'm quite suspicious of the fact that everything is done by sound frequencies these days. And I'm convinced there's a lot of subliminal programming which is happening under the radar by stuff which is being stripped into these digital recordings. So it suits the master occultists that run these industries very much that things are all now done digitally, because I'm convinced there's all kinds of dark sorcery going on a sonic level.
Mark, you're a musician, aren't you? And with that in mind, we have a friend of the show, a guy called Norbs, and we're talking about how music can not only just subliminal stuff within there, but actually the frequency that the music is presented at. I don't know if you're aware of any of his work, 432 or.
Yeah. Is that for me? Yeah.
Yeah. Are you aware of any of his work and whatever the 432 frequency is?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, I've covered this majorly. Actually, this comes up in every single question and answer that I ever do. Whenever I do a public talk and I open it up to questions at the end, there is always a question about 432 versus 440 hertz.
People seem bloody predictable.
That's why I wasn't going to talk about it.
It's really interested in knowing about this.
Out there.
I've prepared a few notes on this because I had a feeling it would come up, and it is discussed at length in my current book, Musical Truth Volume 2. I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it because it makes the point better than I can if I try and remember it. So let me just read these few lines. So I've said, for many years, the standard tuning pitch was set at A equals 432 hertz, where the musical note A vibrates at that frequency and all subsequent notes come in proportional accordance. Musicians and audiophiles alike agreed that this was a natural harmonic frequency and an obvious choice. In 1917, however, attempts were made by America's Rockefeller Foundation, those nice people, to change the pitch to A equals 440 hertz. This failed to gain any ground at the time, so a second attempt was made towards its instigation at the start of World War II. An international conference held in London in 1939 recommended that A equals 440 be adopted. This decision perplexed musicologists who maintained that 440, described as equal temperament or concert tuning, was anything but the sensible choice that 432, known as just intonation, was. 432 is said to synchronize with the rhythms of human brainwaves, the rest of nature, and with the frequency of the earth itself. And music performed to that pitch is thought to therefore have healing or at the very least soothing and calming properties. 440, in contrast, was thought disturbing and dissonant on an unseen level, with music performed at that pitch having unsettling effects on those exposed to it. So it would appear that 440 was deliberately chosen to cause distress and unease among listeners who, of course, would be completely unaware that the music is affecting them in that way. And it really wouldn't have been too difficult to keep 432 as the standard pitch had the controllers of these industries had humanity's best interests at heart. There's a bloody novelty, eh?
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? But let me take a small break there just to say to anyone listening, and if anyone's interested in knowing anything further about these subjects, Mark's written 2 volumes on this called Musical Truth, Volume 1 and 2, and there's a third one on the way. That's right, Mark, isn't it?
Well, at some point there will be, yeah. It's unavoidable. This is my life now.
It's not bad though, is it, mate? You wouldn't have predicted it 10 years ago, but I'll tell you what, I wouldn't swap it. It's a pain in the arse sometimes.
Here we are on a Friday night, and it's pissing down with rain, as you say, outside. And 10 years ago, I'd have been on my way to a gig now. I'll be in the car with records in the boot, and I'll be off to some club, and I'll be there till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning playing tunes and getting back about 5 o'clock in the morning. And instead, here I am in my dressing gown with a drink, on the line to you lot, talking about whatever the hell we're talking about tonight. So how things have changed.
Good lad.
Who would have thought it would turn out like this?
I'm not sure where I pressed mute there along the way, but I hopefully I mentioned Musical Truth Volume 1 and 2 and your website, markdevlin.co.uk, and you YouTube Mark Devlin TV. Sorry, that's Mark Devlin TV.
Yeah.
Anywhere else we can get you? There was something here, a Spreaker. What on earth is that?
Well, John, rather than you keep killing it, Mark, do you want to do it properly? Do you want to give yourself a shout out, mate, where people can find you? Because I think there's a lot of info that you've got and do that would be great for people who weren't aware of you to use.
All right, so I've got my books, Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2, which are available on Amazon. But if anyone wants to get a copy from me direct and cut Amazon out of the picture, then I'm happy to do that, and I can mail books to anywhere in the world. You just got to drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and we can arrange payment by PayPal or something. So then my main website is markdevlin.co.uk, My YouTube, as you just said, is youtube.com/MarkDevlinTV. And Spreaker is where I host all my podcasts and all my audio content. So I've got my Good Vibrations podcast, which is conversation-based like this. Then I've got my Sound of Freedom conscious music podcast, which is music which goes completely against the grain of all the corporate fodder that's put out there. It's music by...
You are segueing into my question with that, Mark.
Excellent. This is music by real artists that are putting across meaningful messages and treating music the way it should be, as an outlet for, true art. And there's a few of them.
So there are some white hats out there.
There's a few of them out there. You have to look very hard to find them. You'll never find them by turning on your radio or your TV or going down your local club. You have to hunt and dig, but it's all out there. And my Sound of Freedom show is a showcase where I bring together many of these artists and lots of this music and put it out there for people to get all in one place. Some great music still being made, but you just wouldn't know it.
Well, I'm definitely heading over there because I need some. I am a music fan. I'm a musician. I love music. I've been immersed in it my whole life. And it's something I've always prided myself, I guess, because, rooting for the underdog, whatever. Once radio became so stereotyped and just boxed up, and there was so many, categories, and when I grew up, I could listen to one station and hear every genre of music, from the blues to R&B to rock to old 50s, and it was all on one station. That all changed mid 70s, late 70s. So I just quit listening to radio and started looking for my own people, my own music, my own things that spoke to me. And it always had to speak to me at a very spiritual level, a very creative level, a very artistic level, technical, all of that. And rarely was any of that being presented on the radio. In fact, it seemed to be the very antithesis of what was on the radio. It was not working out at all listening to the radio for me. So I dug and found groups that to me were speaking something to all of this, trying to say some truth, trying to say some what's going on behind the scenes. But inevitably, even before I found about the 432 or Flat Earth or any of these things that have really opened my eyes, they always would just let me down in some way. Some song would come out with some, terrible lyrics or some dribble, commercialized, aimed for the radio crap. Every band, eventually it felt like sold out. I don't know. It just speaks to that whole idea of maybe they do get into the industry with the talent and the drive to bring truth and bring a meaningful thing. And because of these rituals and these people that are in the way to block all the good, there's just no way to get that out there. Or is there possibly a few that have made it through and gotten those messages out, and that's why they've been killed?
Yeah. You get differing views on this depending on who you speak to. So there's some people that will state that many artists start out with good intent. They want to just put their music out and they've got messages to convey. And when they make it big, they hit a certain level, they come up against the true nature of the industry and they're controlled from that point on one way or another. Then there's other more suspicious, cynically minded researchers like me who tend to think that any artist that's elevated to any kind of prominent position is in full knowledge of what they're doing and is, part of the agenda. So the jury's kind of out on whether that's a hard and fast rule. I think there's certainly two leagues. There's the likes of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, to use them as examples once again. And I would suggest that right from the start, those groups were in full knowledge of what it was they were going to be used for. There's plenty of speculation that both of them were connected to the Tavistock Institute, and Mick Jagger came out of the London School of Economics, of course, and then became a bloody rock star. So that's hardly a natural career path. And then I think you've got other groups that show a certain amount of talent and skill off their own back, and this gets noticed by the spotters in the industry, and they think, wow, this group influences people, so we need to get them on side so that they're putting out the kind of messages that we want to get put out there. And so these groups are made an offer and they're brought into the fold. And before they know what it is they've got themselves embroiled in, it's too late to leave. So there's different ways that these people come into the industries. There's the lifetime actors as well, of course, the people that are born into these families, We mentioned Jim Morrison and his dad earlier. So there's plenty of examples of musicians who are born into key bloodlines and they're given these roles. They're just told, you're going to be an influential musician and you're going to use your art to change societal attitudes. And there's been countless examples of that over the decades.
On that subject of the Laurel Canyon sort of military intelligence side of things, I mean, I've heard a lot of the Jim Morrison and the Doors and his father being Gulf of Tonkin responsible. What are some other examples of military intelligence in the sort of Laurel Canyon or even modern day bands and figures?
Well, there's all kinds. There's loads coming out of Laurel Canyon, the story that was told by Dave McGowan, which really set me on this style of research into starting to look into the backgrounds of some of these people. So out of Laurel Canyon, you had the likes of Frank Zappa. His father was involved in chemical bioweapons research. You've got John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. His father was a career military man. Most of those musicians coming out of that scene were, Joni Mitchell and bloody all the members of the Byrds, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, all those kind of groups. Then you can look at different genres like punk and new wave. The punk scene is absolutely infested with family connections into the CIA and the Pentagon and the White House and the Defense Department and different aspects of the military, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, like you wouldn't believe. There's a big punk scene that grew up out of Washington, D.C., so it's just on the doorstep of the friggin' Pentagon and the rest of it. All these bands coming out of that one area. There's the classic story of the Copeland family, of course, which I tell in all my public talks. There was this career CIA officer, legendary in intelligence circles, by the name of Miles Copeland, and he had 3 sons who were all put to use in the music industry. Miles Copeland Jr., Ian Copeland, and Stuart Copeland, who people know as the drummer with the group The Police. And so they had a major stranglehold over many of the artists that emerged out of the punk and new wave scene, both in the US and the UK. And they had all these companies through which they would promote these bands. And they gave the companies names whose initials spell out the truth of, what that family was all about. They had Copeland International Artists, CIA. They had Frontier Booking International, FBI. They had International Record Syndicate, IRS. And then they had the group The Police, with Sting, as in Sting Operation. So it's not as if there was any shortage of clues as to what they were all about. And then, you can go into every genre, look at hip-hop, even reggae. Bob Marley's father, Norvell Sinclair Marley, was a British naval officer for a time. And he ran a plantation in Jamaica. And then Bob Marley comes out
on that one, guys. Are you talking about is that why Bob Marley died of smoking cannabis through cancer?
He didn't. He died.
He didn't. He died from a prick in his toe that a CIA agent gave him.
Yeah, that's right.
Shoot a
That was
try
Danny.
on.
It was Danny
I'm not
Baker.
saying that. I'm saying one of the urban myths, certainly I remember, is Bob Marley died of cancer, and all you ever see is him smoking weed. And that's me just being,
it was Danny
what
Baker, Adam. He had a sort of charity match with Danny Baker, that hideous radio bloke.
That paragon of truth and virtue.
The point I'm making, really, with regards to its validity, is it's clearly out there in the public psyche that it's in my head. I didn't invent it on my own. Do you know what I mean? I've heard that somewhere. And again, you're alluding there to how everything is controlled. We talk about and this stuff with regards to how history's controlled, but some of the stuff you're saying, Mark, is like there. That's why I jumped in, because actually it's a bit of a slap.
I am alluding to that, and people are going to disagree, clearly. And people must make of it what they will. I've thrown myself into this research, and I see patterns and trends emerging. And people often say, well, when it comes to the Laurel Canyon crowd, of course you'd find fathers that were involved in the military, because they had the draft back then, and loads of guys joined the military. Well, yes, they did. But what you find with these musicians is the fathers were, in almost all cases, very high-ranking military officials, generals, admirals, that kind of thing. You're not finding rank and file foot soldiers here. You're finding very key figures. And when you find this happening time and time again in different genres, in different decades all over the world, it really does start to go beyond just one of those things or coincidence. It does to my mind anyway. I mean, the Bob Marley thing is a total enigma because you've got the possibility that Bob was rebelling against his father and that he was genuine through his music. I've always loved his music, and I always considered him to be a very sincere individual, very consciously awakened. And maybe he was, but you've still got this anomaly of that's who his father was. And his son, Ziggy Marley, whose real name was David, moved to Israel some years ago, and he seems to be very much in with the Zionist regime of Israel. He's given Hebrew names to all of his kids and plays concerts in Tel Aviv and stuff like that, whereas you might think the son of a conscious artist would not want anything to do with that kind of regime. So these are all anomalies. That's all tied in with the Rastafarian religion, of course, which has links to Judaism and stuff. But it's a real head-scratcher, and people say that about Jim Morrison as well. They will say, oh, well, he was probably just rebelling against his father. He used to say in interviews that his parents were dead when they clearly weren't. We've just got straight rebellion here. Well, if it really was just one or two cases, you could argue that that's what was going on. But when you find it time and time again with all these family connections, it starts to become very suspicious. It does to a world-weary, jaded, individual like me.
What strikes me, mate, is the people that you're mentioning, and if we were talking about S Club 7 or Take That or whatever in terms of control and stuff, but I'm really taking note in terms of the evidence you're citing, and the names you're saying, those that people would think are those associated, as you say, with the freedom movement. Actually, you're saying is still quite clearly has links to the controlled narrative.
Well, they do. And the likes of S Club 7 never influenced culture in the way the likes of Bob Marley and Jim Morrison and all these people did. It's also social movements that we think of on the surface as being benign and for the people. So the feminist movement that came out of the 1960s, spearheaded to a large extent by Gloria Steinem, which was all about supposedly the emancipation of females and getting them into the workplace and making them the equals of their male counterparts. That appears to be all about equality for females, right? So that's all good. But when you get down to the true nature of what that agenda was, which is all about getting females into the workplace and contributing to the taxation system so that there's that much more income for the IRS. And then you've got females going out to work and putting their kids into state-sponsored childcare. So you're breaking up the traditional family unit and the nurturing role of mothers. So that's what that social engineering exercise was all about. And then you come to realize that Gloria Steinem was a CIA asset in the employ of the CIA. So you think, oh, well, I guess that movement wasn't all we thought it was then. And we get this with so many things, that whole hippie counterculture scene.
I was just going to ask, what about the psychedelic movement? Because I wanted to go on to that.
Oh, yeah. On the surface, that would appear to be all about anti-establishment, anti-war sentiment. It would appear to be all about young people unplugging from the system and discovering love and peace and disavowing themselves from war and all this kind of thing. But then you look at many of the key figures that got that whole scene going, like Dr. Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters and the Grateful Dead, who were very much the poster child group for that whole generation. Well, the Grateful Dead's personnel are absolutely infested with links to Bohemian Grove, Skull and Bones, and the CIA. And the road manager for the Grateful Dead for some time was a guy by the name of Alan Trist, whose father, Eric Trist, was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is a think tank connected with social engineering and changing societal attitudes. So now you've got some questions about how genuine and grassroots that entire hippie counterculture scene was, particularly when you factor in all these bands and all the military connections there. So if one or two fads and trends of movements were contrived and not all we thought they were, maybe it's the case with all of them. And maybe it warrants some research into all these different major social movements that we've had.
Well, I don't know about you, Mark, but with the psychedelic stuff, I wasn't around back in the 60s or whatever, just missed that one. But what I did see was a resurgence around, well, it came on my horizon around sort of 2007. There was a massive resurgence, and they renamed them from psychedelics to entheogens, and it changed into this into something else. And again, I know you've avoided psychedelics and entheogens, as have I. Do you think it was some sort of, or is some sort of trap, a tool, or a weapon? Because that's what really I mean, I was right into it. I was growing the mushrooms. I had all the entheogens that you could think of, but I never took any of them because I was quite cynical about doing the research into Leary and that sort of thing. You know, there was a small possibility that this was a trap. What do you think?
Yeah. You've got to ask yourself why the establishment would have any kind of vested interest in large numbers of people taking psychedelics or entheogens if they were all about personal upliftment and going to amazing conscious places, journeys of conscious exploration. Certainly, there would appear to be that aspect to it. So I know a lot of people that have done psychedelics, hallucinogenics over the years, and they've told me that they've had nothing but positive experiences from it. A lot of people say that they woke up to great truth, and they're now on the path to researching all this good stuff as a result of taking those products, those compounds. And I've no doubt that they had those positive applications in their lives. But for every person that you meet with a story like that, you'll also meet someone with a horror story about how these things have screwed up their lives. They've led to psychosis or schizophrenia or memory loss. It seems to be the same kind of thing as the different reactions people have to certain diets. So you'll have some people who can go from eating meat to being a full vegan with absolutely no problems at all. They make that transition smoothly. You'll then have other people that have eaten meat all their lives that attempt a vegan diet, and they will tell you that they suffered horrendous health problems as a result. Maybe they weren't doing it properly, but either way, their transition was anything but the smooth one that somebody else's was. And it seems to be the same with these drugs, So I don't deny that there are personal conscious benefits to be had from ingesting these things. Like you said, I've never done them myself. That's mainly because I just like being in control of things, and I've always thought that I've just never liked the idea of going somewhere where I don't have control.
Well, the drugs don't affect the personal development or the changes. They're a conduit. They're a shortcut in many cases towards personal development.
Sure.
But the desire for the personal development needs to be there. They're not most importantly, they're not a necessity for the personal development, but they are in many cases, and quite rightly described, they are quite a useful shortcut to these things if used properly. Obviously, anything abused.
Exactly. I can't tell you the number of people I know who dropped acid and tried to go to a movie or tried to go to a public event. That's not the way. It's all about set and setting.
But I think the point here is
the
terms on which people take these things, these psychedelics, hallucinogenics, call them what you will, entheogens. If it's somebody going on a personal journey of discovery and, just going through this process for themselves, that's an entirely different scenario to when it happens on a communal or group basis. So what you had in the 60s was you had all these music festivals and all these hippie communes and hangouts and stuff, and much of the LSD that was present at these events was being distributed by the CIA. There's documentation to prove this. It's no longer speculation. It's absolutely evidential.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
CIA was putting this stuff out. So then you can take it forward to the situation we had in the UK, and I've done a lot of work on this and a lot of interviews and public talks. The acid house, the birth of the rave dance music scene in the UK, coming out of the late 80s, going into that rave scene of the very early 90s. On this scene, the LSD had been replaced by MDMA, ecstasy. And so you had kids, getting together in their huge numbers and all doing this stuff and listening to music and being exposed to all these strobe lights and things like that. Now, when it's happening in a group setting like that, it's not an individual experience, it's a collective experience. And if you're at a rave or some kind of festival where you've got images being beamed up onto a huge screen, and you've got music, sound frequency, all on a digital sort of electronic level being absorbed, and you've got large numbers of people all having their brain chemistry altered by being on the same drug, now you've got an entirely different scenario because it's on somebody else's terms. Some other party is dictating the kind of experience that all these people are having. It's no longer individual. And that's where the concern lies, I think. So, you know, the desire with flooding the market with these products, whether it's LSD or ecstasy or these other drugs that have come along from time to time, is to try and get them experienced in a group type situation like this, rather than have individuals discovering these things for themselves on their own terms. They want it on their terms, not on any individual's terms.
So when you talk about that, Mark, then that puts the DJ in quite a powerful position. And what I was going to ask was, do you think any, or do you know of any DJs that proverbial or literally sold their soul to the devil? Have you ever been offered?
Well,
no,
John, can I just, Mark, I was a child of that era, so particularly in the early 90s, indulged in that. That was a chapter of my life.
Sure.
And I would concur. I mean, there were certain DJs you'd go to for the experience that they would give you, and I suppose that's the skill of the job. Now that for me was enhanced in that era. A couple of Red Bulls and a shitload of vodka now does it a little bit, to be fair. But I'm getting older, you know. But do you get my point? I think there is immense control in the input that you guys give us in that altered state. Actually, you can lift me from a somber state to absolute euphoria.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing with DJs as you get with musicians. I spoke earlier about how you get certain individuals that are pushed up through the ranks and they become the influential ones that drive the culture. And it's absolutely the same with DJs. So I've never been anywhere near that top league, and thank God for it, because I spent many years wanting to be on BBC Radio 1 or 1 Extra or one of these high profile stations. And I used to get very frustrated that I was always sending up my demo tapes and always hassling them and saying they should get me on their station, and they kept knocking me back. They just weren't interested. At the time, I took it as a personal slight, you know, but now I realize it was my greatest blessing. What a bloody nightmare that would have been to have got involved with that at that level of things.
Hell yeah.
So now you've got the superstar DJs, the likes of David Guetta and Tiesto, Armin van Buuren, Paul van Dyk, Steve Aoki, Calvin Harris, Pete Tong, Paul Oakenfold, Carl Cox, these kind of guys. And it's clear that these are the Pied Pipers of their scenes. They are absolutely driving where this whole culture goes. You can have somebody like David Guetta up on stage in front of 50 to 100,000 people, because these events, these festivals take place on a huge scale now. And this is reflected in the DJ's salaries. Guys like Guetta can reportedly earn upwards of £50,000 per gig for 2 hours work. Nice work if you can get it, right? But all a guy like that has got to do is stand up there at his podium. And I've likened this to a sort of religious altar, because many of these dance festivals are like religious gatherings. You got the crowd down there, it's like the religious congregation. Then you got the DJ up at the DJ booth, which is like an altar, and he's like the priest conducting the crowd. And all he's got to do is wave his hands in the air or put his arms up in a Christ-like messianic pose, which you see guys like Guetta doing all the time. And he can control 50,000 people to mimic that action and do the exact same thing. Then he can start clapping his hands along with the tune, and 50,000 people will start clapping along with him. That's an incredible amount of influence for one individual to have over such a large throng of people. And we've never really seen that before.
Do you think it's another example of, because I mean that's current, and like I say, I was early 90s when I was going out enjoying myself like that, and it was a very, very different environment back then. And I just wonder whether what you see is natural human creation, and then as soon as it is recognized as having some significance in society, the machine adopts it for its own purposes.
That's a very good question. It's one that I've spent a lot of time reflecting on when it comes to the UK dance music scene that grew up out of the roots of acid house. I'm still not able to ascertain with any direct proof that this whole scene occurred from the very outset at the hands of military intelligence or any kind of nefarious input.
Mate, I met my wife for the first 3-4 months, stood next to her, maybe offering her a bottle of water every now and again, but smiling and that. And it was a very, very, very different culture to what I see it is now for the youth of when I was that age. You know what I mean? That it seems to be.
I think we were lucky enough organic, innocent roots, doesn't it?
Right. I think we were lucky enough, Adam, to be at the age where we caught the early crest when it was still an organic thing. Because all my experiences in all these realms have been positive.
Well, with that in mind, the final point with it is, I would suggest that people of the 60s era would have stated the same. We can look back and look at the chemical components of both MDMA and LSD and see their synthetic origin.
Well, they do. I speak to original
military use.
I know guys in their 60s and 70s that were there in the 60s in the midst of that whole thing. And many of them are still in denial. They will swear till their dying day that whole scene was pure and organic, even though there's evidence to show that there was massive input from the intelligence agencies. And I think that there's certainly some input from some shady sort of organizations when it comes to the acid house rave scene. It's not as obviously documentable as the 60s scene. But the question is whether it started out as innocent and organic and was steered off in certain desired directions once it had gained momentum, or whether it was, controlled from the start. And it's still a question that I'm trying to answer, to be perfectly honest with you. I speculate on it in the book. It's a very difficult one to answer. If anyone's got any direct documentary proof that these scenes were controlled from the very start, I would love to see it. The reason I've got my suspicions is because it's happened so many times before with so many other scenes, and I just cannot accept that a culture that has affected so many people and has become so influential would have been allowed to have flourished under its own steam, and gone off its own directions.
I've got to ask then, Mark.
The controllers that we have don't allow that kind of thing to happen. And that's why I've got my suspicions about it.
Well, in that exact vein, then I've got to ask, what are your thoughts on the flat Earth? Has that been controlled from the start? Was it a release? Was it a grassroots stumbling upon thing? I'm in the camp that it was released and it was timed, but I think I'm in the minority on that front, but I'd be interested to know what your research has pointed at.
Right. Well, the controllers that we have, who are dark occultists when we get down to it, they are practitioners of sorcery and black magic and occult ritual. There's so much evidence to show that this is the case. They have a very good understanding of the human psyche, and they seem to understand how humanity responds to certain stimulants and certain situations. So it's not too much of a stretch, as far as I'm concerned, to think that they would have known that if they had released information regarding the Earth being flat, which challenged the official narrative that we've all been entrained in through our lives, it would have led to a massive rift between people, and it would cause huge division, and it would pit friend against friend, brother against brother. And they would have been absolutely right, because we've all seen that happen, right? So I think there would have been foreknowledge of the type of reaction that would happen were they to release this kind of information as some kind of psyop. So I think it's perfectly possible that there is a psyop aspect to it, and that they had an interest in trying to divide the so-called truth movement and get people arguing about all this stuff to divert them from other things that are going on, and also to just break up any kind of unity that might have been there before.
Yeah.
Because there's people I don't speak to now over this issue because we disagree on this stance. It's not me cutting them off; it's them cutting me off.
Yeah.
And we've all seen posts from people saying, if you believe in flat Earth, get the fuck off my Facebook page. You're no friend of mine.
Well, it just makes me wonder, whether they're trying to divide and conquer. So, they're releasing JFK and the moon landings, and they're just chucking out this conspiracy after conspiracy. And then finally, someone around the board table said, we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to release the flat Earth because nothing so far has worked in terms of completely dividing religion, sex, creeds, everything.
Right.
It's time for the H bomb or the F bomb of flat Earth, I think
the mistake a lot of people seem to make is that they assume that the flat Earth thing is a psyop, so they assume there's no validity to it, and it must all be bullshit. But wouldn't it be a master stroke if they sort of cooked this whole thing up as a psyop and they controlled the narrative, but in actual fact, what the narrative is putting forward by way of information has validity
and is
true. If people would only look at the information, detach themselves from any kind of ulterior motives that might be involved, and actually look at the information, then it speaks for itself. I just do not understand how anyone who considers themselves open-minded can look at all the evidence for the place that we live not being a spinning ball hurtling through the infinite vacuum of space, and they just can't see that. Versus the traditional narrative that we've all been handed all our lives through mainstream media, state-sponsored education, government departments, Royal Society, scientific groups and individuals. That would be a bit of a red flag, wouldn't it, for people that understand how this world is run and how everything else is a lie and everything else is disinformation to disempower us and keep us away from truth. Why would it be any different with this one? So if people would only look at the information and just treat it on its own merits, then you come to the tantalizing possibility that we may have a psyop in place, but the psyop may be valid.
Well, also that we hold on, Adam. We may have a psyop in place, but we as the people may be able to make that psyop backfire. And if we can do what you just said, look at some evidence with a rational mind, then it may have started off as a psyop, but we may be able to flip it in terms of creating that unity and the us against them. We're the ones that we see your spinning ball bullshit, and now we're asking for your explanations, and we're not standing for it anymore. So that's where I hope it will go. But over to you, Adam. Oh, sorry.
No, all I was going to say was I was just going to draw a slight with development of the club scene, and I'd just draw a slight analogy, and that's like, certainly for me now, Mark, it still feels like 1990, early 90s, with us hiring out a nightclub. My mates doing the mix. I couldn't mix for shit. You know what I mean? But I could stand on
mix a cake.
I could stand on the speaker and dance, mate. I could do that. That was I was like the Bez of things. Do you know what I mean? But it's still, for me, the flat Earth scene. It doesn't feel. It feels very organic still at this stage. It doesn't. There are obviously the accusations people throw out at certain individuals, rightly or wrongly, but for me, it still feels a very grassroots thing that seems to have been, however it's been implanted into us, it does seem to be organic to me, not necessarily at the stage yet where we have the 100,000-seater stadiums and the message is very unified. Part of the pleasure of flat Earth is no one agrees, even as guys here. We don't have the same opinion, and that's part of the beauty of the journey.
You might be right, man. I can't say for definite one way or the other, and that goes for most things, to be honest. I tend not to be someone that will make an outrageous statement and then stick to it like concrete. I'm very fluid and flexible in things. Certainly my stance on the Paul McCartney thing has changed over time. and I've been open about that. So yeah, you could be absolutely right in terms of where the flat Earth thing came from. I don't have any attachment either way to it being a psyop or it being organic, but all I see is that there's validity to the information, and it's changed my perspective on things.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mark, on that note, we've got to talk about fall, Beatles, because you have a different take on things, don't you?
Before we do, guys, can we just double check that? I think Josh has actually joined us. Are you there, Josh?
I am here.
Oh, say hello, mate. Say hello.
In rapt attention. No. Hi.
Welcome along, man.
Mark. Yeah, I finally made it home. I said, F it. I can get my car later. I got more important things to do. I got Mark Devlin sitting on a line at my house.
9/11. You had to be here.
I had to be here. I absolutely had to be here. So priorities are set. Car will be dealt with tomorrow.
All right. That's a good priority there. So, yeah, McCartney, he crops up in every bloody conversation I do. My stance on him has changed slightly, yes, because in the first book that I put out, Musical Truth Volume 1, I recounted the whole legend that has come to be known as PID, Paul is Dead. And this is kind of a conspiracy theory within the conspiracy world. And it states that the real Paul McCartney died in a car accident sometime in 1966, and the date is often given as 9/11 of 1966, but there tends to be disagreement over whether that represents September 11th or the 9th of November, 9/11, depending on whether you're going with American or British date formats. But anyway, the idea is that the rest of the Beatles and Brian Epstein and the forces that control them worked to cover this whole thing up, and they hired a replacement, an imposter, to play the role of Paul McCartney so that the public would be none the wiser. And that's the individual we have to this day. Then there's a sort of slightly sinister take on that whole thing, which was that Paul's car accident was no random tragic accident, but that it was planned for, or it might not have been a car accident at all, but he was taken out and it was known that it was going to be coming, which gave time for this individual who we think of as Fall, and his name is often given as William Shepherd, aka Billy Shears, hence the may I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears on the Sgt. Pepper album. He's supposed to be the guy that took over the role. So I bought into that for quite some time because it was quite a standard thing to do so when you get into this area of research. But over time, this whole McCartney enigma has just absolutely captivated me, and it's taken up so many weeks and months of my life that I'll never get back, that I just feel more convoluted and confused about the whole thing than ever now. I've reached a point where I've accepted that there's actually no verifiable evidence that Paul McCartney ever actually died in 1966. However, I do not accept that there has been just one Paul McCartney all these years. It's pretty clear to me now, looking at photos and video footage from through the decades, so before 1966 and after, that what we see is not just one man, but certainly two, and probably more than two. And through much discussion with many other researchers in this field, and there's lots of disagreement there, let me tell you, not just in Flat Earth, but every single seasoned researcher that you'll meet in this subject area will have a slightly different take on things. But the general consensus among many of us is that there have been at least two Paul McCartneys. So we're left with the question of who these people are. Do we have the original biological Paul plus an imposter? Do we have, in fact, fraternal twins? It's been suggested that Paul might be one of twins, and that we've had this big joke played on us all these decades where they've been pushing one twin in and out of the Paul role and presenting him to us as Paul McCartney. And that's why they look slightly different from time to time. And there's all these anomalies in their appearances and their height and things that they say in interviews. Or do we have more than two? Because when you look at the photos again, you often find individuals that are said to be Paul McCartney that don't bear any visual resemblance to either of the other two. So it really is a mind F. Do we swear on this?
You certainly can. Absolutely, man.
All right.
I've gone quite a ways down. Yeah. I've gone quite a ways down this hole myself, Mark. And at this point, I'm almost convinced there could be up to 4 Paul McCartneys,
Exactly.
at least a couple of John Lennons. I doubt Ringo Starr played on any of the albums. I mean, I've seen all the different crazy rabbit holes on this stuff.
Right.
And certainly the gentlemen, I don't have any of my notes on this. I should have prepared better. But there's a guy performing today in this era, and he's doing the Beatles songs. He looks exactly like
this Mark Stacer? This guy.
That's him.
John
Thank
Lennon.
you. I could not get the Lennon guy. I'm so out of touch here with this.
Yeah. There was a movie called Let Him Be
Absolutely.
in 2009.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be, according to some, it's present-day John Lennon, who never actually died. So, boy, that's another whole bloody rabbit hole to fall down.
Exactly. Well, I mean, to me, all this kind of
to fall down. Get it?
Right. Go ahead.
No, just
all right.
Yeah, I got
all these things speak to the different
pride comes before a fall.
And the MK Ultra type, shocks they throw into the media on like Lennon's death. I mean, the things that happened here in the States, I can't imagine what happened there in the UK the day he was shot. The whole country went ape, and it was like an MK Ultra, like the assassination of Kennedy, the assassination of any of the leaders.
Right. And let's not forget that George Harrison got stabbed up terribly in his home in late 1999. An intruder broke in somehow to this compound that he had near Henley-on-Thames, Friar Park, which was allegedly one of the most highly guarded houses anywhere in Britain, state-of-the-art security system and all that. But somehow...
Didn't his wife beat the guy's ass?
I'm not sure. I didn't hear that.
I know she was like a something degree black belt, I know. Right. And I had heard that, his wife had been the one that actually defended him.
Well, maybe that's what saved George, because he was stabbed up multiple times, and it would appear to be an attempt at taking him out, a hit, just like on Lennon. Only this time he got all stabbed up instead of shot. But George survived that attack, although he died less than 2 years later of cancer, which was seemingly brought on by the whole affair.
Not Danny
so you've got
Baker
that aspect
again.
to it. And just an observation to make about the McCartney situation, whether the original Paul died and was replaced, or whether we've got 2 individuals paging in and out of the role of Paul, this could not have taken place without the full complicity of British military intelligence, right? Yeah. Because Paul has been knighted by the Queen, and anyone that comes into close contact with the royal family is supposed to get a thorough vetting from MI5 in terms of their affiliations and stuff. So if in some insane way a small closed group comprised of the Beatles and their immediate management had managed to pull off this trick, it would have been discovered at some point by British military intelligence, right? There's no way that could have flown under the radar. So the fact that we have more than one McCartney, which we do, proves that there is complicity there among the intelligence services. And this lends weight to the theory that the Beatles all along were connected with military intelligence and the Tavistock Institute and all this, and their role was to influence culture in line with social engineering agendas. Just wanted to make that point.
But what about Mark?
And they came... Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, what about, yes, they had a huge influencing role, and that was their role. But what about a secondary role was to introduce all this fall and falling down rabbit holes and spending immeasurable amounts of time and effort and everything into this distraction.
Right, absolutely. Look at us now, right?
Exactly.
Right. Well, you've got to consider that because, like I just said, the amount of man hours that I've wasted, well, I don't know if it's wasted, invested, you might say, but spent either way on looking at this thing just cannot be measured. And when you factor in all the other researchers around the world that look at this, I know people that study this full time. I get emails every single day from certain people saying, oh, look at this photo and I've discovered this snippet from an interview and stuff like that. They never stop looking at this.
Well, like
and
JFK or Jack the Ripper even. I mean, from 1888. I mean, they're still
and we still
hammer
don't
and
know
tongs. Yeah, well, I think we do, but, well, Yeah.
Well, as far as them being a manufactured product and being put in place when they were, I mean, it was perfect timing with the war and everything. Everybody was, marching and taking over colleges. And so, boom, here's this love, peace, harmony. Let's all chill. Kind of like I thought about it, and someone in chat, I think it was Spirit of the Longthorn, was talking about how the ecstasy era kind of hit as the punk and the rebellion and the Rage Against the Machine music and all these anti-government, let's take it back, was really hitting the peak. And then boom, here comes the peace, love, let's all hug it out in the clubs scene.
Right. And the rave scene in the UK emerged in the middle of Thatcherism, or towards the end of Thatcherism.
Yeah.
So there was all this
Absolutely.
angst and this anger at the unfairness of the Tory party and their regime and their hold over society. So it was seen to be in some way a rebellion against all of that. So the timing of these scenes and these movements is very interesting when you look at other things that were going on in society when they came along.
It just always seems to me, though, that most of the time when you're looking at things like conspiracy, that you're looking into the past, say Jack the Ripper or JFK or whatever. There's literally almost no way you can prove it whatsoever. And this is my cunning segue back to Flat Earth in terms of it is actually a conspiracy. It is something you can prove yourself with in terms of experimentation, probably the wrong word, but observation and that sort of thing. And to me, it seems the ultimate thing that they would be trying to hide, and they would bring up all these rabbit holes day after day in order to keep us away from the real truth, which is walk out your front door and look at the world around you, rather than spending hours looking at JFK videos and reading all the books. And it just seems something quite logical now.
So
Well, that's right. Yeah.
I hate to do this.
4 minutes.
We can push it. We can push it. But this is break music coming in now. So we can push a break. But I know, Mark, you said you had to get to bed, that you're not much of the night owl these days.
Well, I'm not the night owl I used to be, but I can stick around for another segment if you'd like me to.
Absolutely.
We would love that. We would love it, Mark. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll love it,
Yeah,
Mark,
it's fun.
because the next segment is an hour and a half long as well.
Well, maybe not all of it, but
No, when you're ready to duck out, my friend, please do so. We appreciate all we get.
But yeah, we're sort of heading into the break, so I think it's customary, isn't it, to get all your details, your wwws and everything out of the way again, because I, for one, am going to go and get Musical Truth Volume 1 and 2, because I think it's fascinating stuff.
excellent. All right, so yeah, both books are available on Amazon. If anyone wants to get them from me direct, signed copies, they can email me at markdevlinuk@gmail.com and we can sort that out. The website is markdevlin.co.uk. The YouTube is /MarkDevlinTV. All my conference talks and presentations are up on there, and my radio interviews. And I've got a Spreaker account, which is where I host all my podcast audio. And that's about it. And I just wanted to mention that you brought up Jack the Ripper there, and we got some more 9/11 synchronicity, because I mentioned in my first book that the date on which the final of Jack the Ripper's victims was found, or was said to be, just happened to be the 9th of November, 1888.
1888.
Isn't that interesting that just came up in the conversation?
As Crow would say, count the ways in which
Right,
all the numbers in that correlate together. Yeah.
And we were talking about the acid house scene there, and of course the second Summer of Love was summer 1988, which is exactly 100 years after Jack the Ripper. So there's another one.
Well, maybe we can go into this in a bit more detail over the on the other side of the break. But I've looked into Jack the Ripper, and I can't help thinking it's an absolute cover-up for a royal slasher of some sort, or a Masonic
Especially
satanic
after
ritual.
the book From Hell, the graphic novel, and then the movie, that really convinced me it was all just a game when they fed it to us again like that.
But looking at
You know, Winston Churchill's father's name always comes up in this research. Have you
That's
come across
right.
Sir Randolph Churchill.
Yes.
Randolph
Yes,
Churchill. And did you know that Winston Churchill was himself a Wiccan witch?
Yeah, I'd heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was quite interesting. Another forced hero, as you say.
Lifetime actor. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Josh, I think we're 50 seconds away.
Sounds good to me. Adam?
I'm all yours, Josh. Whenever you want, I'll stick the TV on. The TV's on. Press play. Guys, if you want to mute, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Great. Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk to you for hours. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, man. It's fun. The time is going very quickly.
See you after the break.
Good to hear. Good to hear.
All right. See you soon.